Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our one-to-one series. I'm lucky enough to be joined this afternoon by the font of technical knowledge, Joe Assael. Now, Joe, obviously, for the last 10 years, we've been used to sort of seeing each other week in, week out, and all over the world. But over the last 18 months, that hasn't been the case. So how have you been?
Yeah, good. Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. As you say, I think we're far more used to seeing each other at the yacht shows and conferences, and obviously your team's events all over the world. So it's obviously a different period that we find ourselves in at the moment. But all in all, yes, I think for Dula Yachts, it's been in fact it's been quite a good 18 months. I mean, we're still a family-owned company with kind of 60 years experience in shipping. You know, there's a lot of depth in the company, a lot of resilience, and 18 months of COVID, you know, in some respects doesn't even kind of register on the radar compared to what shipping's been through over, you know, many decades, which has kind of given us a great kind of foundation, you know, in the yachting world. And as you know, Dula Yachts specialize just in the service delivery of the management side of things. So we haven't been and are not involved in sales and charter, which means that you know, in that initial phase when everyone was kind of panicking at COVID and no one could get to their boats, no one could charter, and although the sales obviously recovered, we were relatively unaffected by that. I mean, yachts need to be managed kind of regardless of what's going on. We did have some interesting discussions about potentially laying up some vessels, but in fact we didn't have any vessels go down that route in the end. We had some that had more extended winter periods or went in earlier. But all in all, the vessels kept operating, be it that they didn't always have an owner or a charter on board. And as a result of that, Dula Yachts has been kind of surfing on through.
So on that point, Joe, do you feel we've heard a lot over the last 18 months about the industry's resilience, and there's always a lot of white noise in this industry around business being as good as it's ever been, orders being up, shipyards operating at capacity at the top end of the market. Do you, obviously, as experts in that area and people who are seeing these market fluctuations before they're sort of becoming apparent to the rest of us, are you seeing that at the moment?
Yeah, we are. I think the industry came out or came into COVID with a lot of momentum. And I think some of what we're seeing is that momentum being carried forward. I think what's really interesting is how a lot of people have found themselves in a fortuitous situation despite the lack of things like boat shows and conferences, which is making a lot of people look quite hard at how they are marketing themselves, because the industry seems to be continuing to turn in the absence of those. But for how long is maybe the question. You know, are we surfing through because we had a good 18 months prior to COVID and we are just relying on that momentum? Or is the industry shifting, digitizing, and becoming an industry that is able to adapt to these kind of situations faster? I mean, in the kind of 2008, 2012 downturn, we lost a lot of industry players because people didn't react quick enough. A lot of middlemen were kind of skimmed out the industry, you know, in some respects in a good way. I feel like the people that are left now, the people that are operating in 2020 and into 2021 are a more resilient and a more dynamic company anyway. And I feel like a lot of people have, you know, taken this in their stride and they've adapted, and we're looking at great new innovative ways to manage vessels, market vessels, talk to our clients, engage with people and deliver services. So in some respects, it's a really exciting time.
Talking of exciting times, and as a fellow Brit, we've been speculating in our office about the realities of our first show season. And although this is a bit of a tangent, it just dawned on me, as a Brit preparing for the European Autumn show season, are you looking forward to it?
On a personal level, I'm very much looking forward to it. I think a lot of what we do is this personal relationship. It's getting a feel for how things are going. It's an intangible relationship with the people that we talk to at shows, we talk to in the shipyards. conferences, and we need to be out and about to get that feel, and that influences decision, strategy. We put down markers constantly to understand where we are in the market, and when we don't have that interaction with people, we're kind of missing that. So we're acting a lot of the time kind of in isolation, and we talk across the various digital platforms, we talk on the phone, but it's not the same. It's not quite the same as being across the table. I think we have kind of we're at the limit of how long we can continue this for. So personally, I'm very keen to get back. From a company perspective, there are still a lot of risks, especially for smaller companies. We're a kind of a medium-sized company, but each of our offices across our different services are quite small. So, our crewing team in Guernsey, finance and administration in the Isle of Man, the technical orientated and compliance in Southampton. It's very hard if you have 2 or 3 key or influential people that go down to a show from each office, and that hotel has a quarantine issue, or the plane that everyone flew out on. Suddenly we're going to lose the whole of our senior management team in one hit, and have them unable to travel and move around freely in the period after the show, irrespective of if there was, the worst would happen and people would actually become sick. So we do have to look at it from a risk perspective and think about, is the reward going to be there? I certainly hope that it transpires that the reward, it comes out on top and we can get out and about. But I think that's going to be kind of weighing on a lot of people's minds. If everyone's there at the show and the worst happens, what's your business continuity plan thereafter?
So moving on to today's topic, as you know by the title of today's conversation, Death by Committee. Now, we, being the media, we tend to sort of like to play devil's advocate with our headlines, and because it's more likely to draw people in, as you know. But I think there's a serious edge to what we're talking about today, and it's not necessarily in a negative sense, but you and I have both had ample experience of the committee structure of this industry. You've obviously achieved some really impressive things with your work in the codification and regulatory area. But I myself know, from having stood on several committees, that perhaps there is a fragmented structure, I guess, to the way this industry is represented on a world stage. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, whether the lack of an overarching industry body has maybe affected the industry's credibility.
You touched on a couple of interesting things. I think, well, firstly, your title, yes. Let's be clear that's to capture people's attention here. And there is a lot of really fantastic organisations out there, and I'm by no means, this conversation is not to undermine the good work that those organisations are doing. And I'm personally on more of those than I can normally reel off, but I'm involved in international standards, international Superyacht UK, Red Ensign Group code developments, Marshall Islands Advisory Committee, Isle of Man, Cayman Island ship owners. I mean, it goes on. So the issue that I think we have is that everyone's time is very precious, and a lot of the associations and these bodies, they do kind of overlap. So I guess, your question of is there lack of overarching body damaging to the industry? I think the answer is it's becoming that way. We've been a small industry for a long time and have struggled to take that step to become more professional. And we are in so many different areas, and it's really refreshing to see as we mature as an industry and we become more aligned with shipping in so many different ways. But there's a lot of big obstacles that we have to overcome. And until we have that unified body, we're going to struggle. I mean, there are examples where we have achieved great things. I know, ICOMIA's work at the IMO in delaying kind of tier 3 was beneficial to the kind of the smaller end of the market. We've now got Superyacht Builders Association have a seat at the IMO and are able to engage in discussions. But the problem we have is we don't have someone who is specifically looking after the Superyacht's interests. So those seats, ICOMIA are an organization for organizations. So for those that don't know, the HISWAs, the US Superyacht Association, the Superyacht UK, regional or national bodies are all then overarchingly represented by ICOMIA, which gives them fantastic breadth, but also a very diluted agenda. Whereas CIBAS are the opposite end of the spectrum, where their seat at the IMO is specifically for the builders, and their entry requirements are specifically for builders building vessels over 40 meters. So what happens when we need to represent an issue with the regulators about crewing or navigation or training issues? We don't have someone making those arguments for us. And at the IMO, where these things are discussed or where regulations are developed, there are NGOs such as ICOMIA and Superyacht Builders Association, and then they have the flag states. Now, to them, but the flags who have an interest in yachting generally also have a large commercial tonnage, and they are not going to jeopardize their commercial tonnage for the sake of a yacht argument. So if the Marshall Islands are negotiating a huge MARPOL issue over here, they are not going to jeopardize that because they're arguing with the same people on a technical issue on super yachts over here. So unfortunately, due to the slightly political nature of the organization, we lose that. And the same goes sometimes for the Red Ensign Group. You know, we're represented by the UK, who out of the UK, Isle of Man, Cayman Islands, you know, the big yacht Red Ensign Group flags, you know, they have the smallest representation in yachts. So, you know, the people that are sat there day in, day out negotiating these things are aware of the yacht agenda, but aren't necessarily, you know, fighting it for us. So then we have to think about, well, how are we going to, you know, how can we address this? And people have tried. You know, it's not that, you know, everyone's been sat on their laurels. I mean, the International Super Yacht Society have made an application to have a seat, to be an NGO at the IMO. And very frustratingly, back in 2018, that they were rejected for the IMO believing that there was already expertise through other organizations that reflected the ISS. So ICOMIA and Superyacht Builders Association, as we've already described, don't quite fit that. So we are still underrepresented at the IMO. And the problem with that is our voice is then, you know, it's not heard. And the more concerning element is that because the IMO believe that we do have a voice there, if they are discussing crew training that may affect the super yacht industry, because there isn't someone at the back of the room raising their flag saying, no, guys, this is actually going to be a problem for a very large sector, X amount of crew members, the silence is kind of tacit acceptance, because they believe that the industry is represented in the room, and therefore not hearing a voice is accepting that the situation is going to be okay. So a lot of things get rolled into super yachting, or would also apply to super yachting, because there's no one there essentially to object. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are really well represented. So for example, in cruise line, so CLIA, the Cruise Line Industry Association, you know, they represent something along the lines of 95% of the world's ocean-going capacity. And when there's a discussion about cruise ships, it's not a question of, you know, oh, you know, is CLIA happy with this, or will they object? CLIA are running the agenda. They are providing papers. They are dictating that conversation. So they have a huge amount of lobbying power, and they're the kind of, you know, the target of what we could become, to show people that, you know, that the you know, the revenue that this brings into the countries, the builders, the crew, the entire industry is massive. And if we could get that kind of lobbying power and representation in the right places, it could really help. So, you know, long answer, but yes, I think the lack of representation in the long run is only actually going to hurt us, you know, and it's something that eventually we're going to have to find a solution to address, essentially.
Well, yeah, you talk about solutions. I mean, from your perspective, why do you think there is such a proliferation? And this is potentially a bit of a sort of tricky question, but historically, why such a proliferation of initiatives and associations ultimately working towards the same overarching goal, perhaps with more focused interests at a minute level? But why do you think we've presented such a fragmented industry to the world?
I think it's probably a couple of reasons. I think firstly, as I mentioned before, we are still a relatively small industry. I think a lot of people on the company side, so the people that are working in the industry, not the organizations, are often kind of hand to mouth on every project, every contract. We are made up predominantly of small people who will fight fiercely for every contract, and especially every client. And as a result of that, we become quite siloed. We become quite insular because you don't want to share what you believe is your USP. You don't want to share data in case it's giving you the edge over your competitor, because if you don't win that next contract, your pipeline goes dry and you're out of business. So because of the size of our industry and the number of micro businesses within it, I think that skews the way that people interact with each other. And I think the way that our organizations are set up is similar. So they're either very specific to get around this issue. They find a hole, they find a niche, and there'll be obviously some overlaps, but there are a lot of niche organizations that will look after something incredibly well, but that's the extent of their remit. There are larger ones. I've already mentioned, International Superyacht Society, who has a very large remit. But when we're looking either geographically or topic specific, we tend to get a little bit of overlap. And I wonder if that is because if they haven't grown or taken off as maybe the organizers would have liked, or they haven't developed into something that they would have hoped, the next person coming along 2, 3, 5 years later goes, oh, there's a hole in this area. We haven't addressed the environmental issues as much as we could have. I mean, there's been people talking about the environmental agenda, rightly so, for forever in yachting, and specifically over the last 10 years. And then it's accelerated the number of these smaller organizations that have been kind of growing and in this space. And it just takes one to kind of pop out on top and actually become like a leader in that area. And until that happens, we just have a lot of people kind of fighting for what they believe is their agenda or their most important part of it, be that CO2, greenhouse gases, plastics, microplastics, whatever it is. So everyone, again, hunkers down, finds a real focus, and then that leaves the bigger picture kind of unattended, and we're left with kind of a lot of smaller organizations filling those holes.
I guess these are smaller organizations with very noble causes, but obviously one of the big things that it comes down to is very often a lack of financial backing, and a lack of budget with which to execute these, as I say, very noble causes.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, in the same way that I described the industry with the micro companies fighting for clients, an NGO and an organization, an association are fighting for members for exactly the same reason. Why should I pay an annual membership fee or a monthly membership fee or a joining fee to, organization X when organizational Y give me more or have a wider scope or throw a better party at the end of the year. So they are fighting for the industry as clients in the same way that the industry is fighting for clients. And again, it comes down to, I think, the size of our industry and its makeup.
So you obviously touched upon the point of data sharing, at which point I crossed my arms because it's a real bugbear of mine. I think someone said it the most adroitly I've ever heard on stage at the Superyacht Forum, when he said, our industry's lack of ability to share transparent market data will one day make it uninvestable. Why do you think we'd all benefit from greater levels of market data? And I think it's important to distinguish between technical data that could compromise a shipbuilder or a naval architect's ability to innovate, but in terms of market data that makes our industry trustworthy and robust in the eyes of outside investment, do you think there's a benefit to be had for sort of growing up in that sense?
I mean, hugely. And I remember the session, and I do completely agree that we're kind of an anomaly, that we've existed for this long without almost external scrutiny or without a kind of a financial benchmarking to allow kind of that corporate investment and to be leveraged. It all comes down to kind of individuals. And that's a wonder almost to a lot of people who come into this industry, kind of that we can continue to operate in that way. So I think from a market perspective, yes, it would certainly benefit for us to open up. I think on a technical basis now with big data as well, there is so much data floating around that we would be foolish not to use it. It can be to everyone's advantage. And there are some great examples of yachts who kind of have open policies on certain environmental things that they've done, or they're sharing data. There's some great initiatives that allow those kind of platforms that people can go and learn. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, every time we have a new build project, we get enthusiastic owners who want to do something interesting with a project, and we have to hold on to those owners. And then we often lose a lot of enthusiasm going back to a lot of basics that don't need to be readdressed, because we've been doing it at another shipyard for 10 years, or the industry's moved on from a certain fuel type or something like that. And we tend to just go over old ground, which is hugely time consuming and hugely expensive for the industry. I mean, if we were to monetize that time and expense in everyone doing the same thing again and again and again, it would be eye-watering. And that's one of the reasons why these boats do cost so much. Everyone says, oh, it's because it's bespoke and it's the interior. But yes, but outside of that, the engineering platform, we're just going over old ground again and again every time we do a project. And that's very wasteful. And I believe that, through the right type of data sharing, we would be able to, eliminate a lot of that. And we need to be able to share this data for other reasons, because you started with talking about market data, which I completely agree with, but there are technical data sources that we are going to have to start to leverage, because there's a couple of regulatory things coming down the pipeline. So we've got the Energy Efficiency Design Index, which at the moment hovers up around the kind of 25,000 gross ton mark, and isn't on a lot of people's radars, especially, sub 500 yacht builder. It's someone else's problem. The bigger boys are aware of certain elements of it because they have to comply with the first stage of it, but then the yacht doesn't have to operate in accordance with the regulations, but they're still a design kind of parameter. The issue we have is this is all about curbing greenhouse gases, and the IMO has a very stringent agenda to get to the 1990s level of greenhouse gases, or to get to 50% of them in the next couple of decades. And then they want to move to a zero greenhouse gas model this century. So we are kind of next in the firing line in yachting. And this is a good example of where we need to start sharing data, because we're burying our heads in the sand saying, it's okay, it's not our problem, tonnage is really high, we don't need to look at this area. But as an industry, that tonnage level is slowly going to be dropping down towards us until it is starting to affect the 100-meter plus vessels, until it is then going to affect the 50-plus meter vessels. And they need data to benchmark it. So again, it all ties into not having this single voice. So we end up with a situation where the IMO is saying, okay, let's now include yachts in this. And they make assumptions about yachts. They say, oh, a yacht is a cargo ship, it's roughly shaped like this, therefore they can be this efficient. And if there's no one in the room to say that is not how a yacht operates, we have different numbers of crew, different numbers of guests, a yacht hull shape won't perform in that way that you're asking us to design to, there's going to be no pushback. And suddenly we're going to have regulations at our doorstep that will make projects untenable. We had a project that we were involved in a little while ago. It was a very large project, and it was up at that 25,000 gross ton threshold. So it was in the order of 220 meters, something along those lines. And because of the restrictions of this design index, it meant that we could only have a vessel that could go 12 knots maximum speed. And that wasn't of interest to the owner. He couldn't get from home port to wherever he wanted to go in enough time, or he couldn't deliver the vessel for his schedule for moving around the world. So the whole thing fell apart, and so it is already affecting. I mean, that was a kind of real kind of top size project, but it will filter down. And if we're not prepared to collate and share data through some sort of centralized source, we're going to be ambushed with the regulators saying, well, we kind of haven't heard from you. We think it should be done like this. Now go away and start designing your yachts in that way. And we're not going to be able to. And I think that's the danger that we lie in if we don't embrace data sharing across both markets, technical, all parts of data sharing.
Well, yeah, you say all parts. I mean, I suppose there's an even more profound consideration, because as well as making our industry more attractive to a potential investor, or educating the clients in terms of technology transfer, obviously a crucial thing is the sharing of collective analysis and evaluation of incidents. And that's ultimately operational safety. And I suppose that overrides anything we've just spoken about. So do you feel that we collectively, there's enough public dissemination of the lessons learned operationally to enhance best practice?
I think there probably is, but you have to know where to look for it, and that it shouldn't be hard to find. I mean, you've got, if a vessel has an incident, they're going to discuss that at their safety committee meeting, the month later. They're going to talk about lessons learned, anything that they should be doing differently, preventative actions. The next stage will be that data is reported up to the management company, and they now start to collect data so that at the end of the year, they can disseminate information fleet-wide. It's actually, we've got a lot of falling from height, or we've got a lot of issues relating to launching tenders, or they can start to spot trends. So that's kind of the next level. So depending on the size of the management company, it depends on the size of the data. Certain incidents are, from a statutory perspective, reportable to either class or flag. So they have an even wider pool of kind of data. That isn't always shared in the most kind of comprehensive manner or usable, because often the data gets thrown into, obviously, their commercial, their deep sea data, maybe mixed in with offshore. There's all sorts of ways that it can be kind of diluted away from super yachts. So it becomes quite hard to see the wood for the trees in that respect. And the classification societies are similar. They're even bigger and will have a larger market share than the flags. And again, you can go and find that data, but then you've got to trawl it. You've got to find out what's applicable to yachts. You've got to go across the different classification societies. So again, there is no one kind of place to look. I mean, on accidents reporting, there is a independent anonymous organization called CHIRP, which is the Aviation and Maritime Confidential Incident Reporting. It's a bit of a mouthful, but CHIRP allows incidents to be reported, and they try and collate information that maybe is going into the black hole of a management company and never kind of coming back out. Because if it's not reportable to a flag state, it's not of a high enough severity, then we lose a lot of that kind of low level metadata that's really useful. So they're a good organization that are trying to kind of do this. But again, we blur the lines because it's going to be passenger ships, cargo ships, yachts are thrown into kind of, sometimes they're defined as themselves as a yacht. Other times they'll come under their kind of SOLAS definition of a cargo ship or a passenger ship or something like that. So again, their data gets kind of washed up in a whole load of other data. So well-intentioned and a very useful source of collating some of these other sources of information, be it from the flag and class, they redistribute MAIB reports and things of that nature. So one to definitely have on your radar. But again, probably still need something centralized for yachting, so we can really focus on what we're doing and what lessons are unique to yachting. Are we having issues with, side shell doors, with launching tenders, with working over side rails, with issues that are unique to our sector, so that we can start to identify trends and patterns and allow us to then put in place the corrective actions to make it a safer environment for our crew on board.
So, Joe, as you know, we've had some technical issues today, and I'm just aware that we may be slightly running out of time here. So I'm going to push you on this last very overarching question, which is very mean of me. But as you know, we tend to wrap these up by asking each person what your outlook is for the super yacht industry, and whether there's anything you feel that we need to change in order to ensure safe passage.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm naturally quite a positive person, so I think I would say that the industry is in a good place, and as I talked about at the beginning, COVID seems to have actually set us onto a slightly different path that no one could have planned, but one that is actually going to be beneficial to everyone in the long run. So I think that's exciting. I think what is concerning are these large regulatory things looming in the distance, like the 50% greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Yachts and ships, they have a 20 to 25 year lifespan. Yachts often longer. So we're only, a generation of ships away from that, and we're only a few generations of ships away from when we should be zero carbon. And there's a lot of really interesting work in that area. And it's exciting that we don't know what that solution is yet. But it's also a little bit scary that those dates are kind of coming at us fast. and we don't know how we're going to achieve that. So exciting and scary at the same time. I think for what needs to change, keeping it on topic with today's discussion, I think people need to engage with their industry bodies. Find a cause or an organization that resonates with your values and reflects your company, and join the discussion. I think sitting on the sideline isn't going to help anyone. And it may be that certain organizations, NGOs, rise to the top, have further reach, start to have that lobbying power. But without their support, we can't just sit and wait for these solutions to be found. We have to drive these solutions. Otherwise, the larger regulatory bodies and ship types are going to impose regulations on our industry which do not fit